Why, hello there, Reylo fam. I am back with another installment of Confessions of a Trashy Reylo Shipper. So, the last video that I made was all about why I ship Reylo. I ended up getting some pretty positive reception to it, which made me really happy. I was extremely excited to read everybody's comments. I get such a kick out of hearing other people's Reylo experience, especially the first time seeing The Force Awakens, because it just seems like we all kind of had this similar WTF, what the heck's going on, so it's amazing. Before I get started, I would like to say that I have a Tumblr account under LittleBird92, and then I also have a DeviantArt account through, my name's Phantom Deviant. I have all of these different usernames to keep track of, but anyway, the painting I have used for this video is one that I did. It's on my Phantom DeviantArt account. I will provide links in the description box. Yeah, this is just like total shameless self-promotion right here, so jump on the bandwagon, people. So in this installment of Confessions of a Trashy Reylo Shipper, I'm going to be talking about something very near and dear to my heart, which is the topic of gender studies. Dun dun dun! I swear every time I mention the term gender studies or the dreaded word, the F word, aka feminism, I see the blood drain from people's faces. But yeah, I'm a history major, and for the past 5 to 6 years I've been studying the relations between men and women and how, I guess popular ideas, or like how the ideal vision of a man and a woman and the type of relationship they have with each other, how those ideas change over time. One of the reasons why it's something that I'm so passionate about now is because I feel like, at least here in the United States, I feel like we're living in a time where a lot of things are changing. Whether you're talking about traditional gender roles in a relationship or you're talking about feminism, everybody's going to have a slightly different opinion about it, especially when it comes to feminism. Oh my god, as a woman, I feel like every single thing that I do is under speculation on whether or not it fulfills some sort of feminist requirement. I'm either too outspoken or I'm too timid. I'm either too dolled up or I'm too much of a tomboy. I either need to be with someone so that I can have tons of babies, or I'm weak for being in a relationship. The same can be applied to men. A man is either too sensitive or he's not sensitive enough. And there's a whole range of expectations on whether or not a man should pay for the first date, or whether the woman should do it or you should go Dutch. Instead of having a set standardized vision of how things should be, everyone just kind of has their own view about how they want it to be, and some people don't really know what they want. They kind of want both. They kind of want the guy to pay for the first date, but at the same time they, want to show that they're a strong, empowered female and whatnot. So it's actually kind of a confusing time because, it's like... So seeing The Force Awakens was actually really interesting for me to watch because especially Rey and Kylo Ren, they raised some really, really interesting questions about the relations between men and women, and especially like when it comes to gender roles. The interactions between these two characters triggered off a lot of emotions in a lot of different people. And I would even say that Rey and Kylo Ren as individuals triggered off a lot of emotions. Prior to seeing The Force Awakens, I never realized just how badly I needed a character like Rey. It's not even that she's a strong, empowered female, it's more that she's just a real girl. And I realize that the camera is like focusing on Kylo Ren's face as I'm talking about Rey, but yeah, fuck you, Photo Story 3. Anyway, my strongest emotion coming out of The Force Awakens was about Rey's character. Not only was I not used to seeing a female in a lead action role, but she was also tough. I mean, she's a tough-ass chick, man. She's resourceful and intelligent and has a really strong sense of self-preservation. She's really not that interested in romance at all. Honestly, she comes across to me as like not being aware of herself in that sense. She was the first female action lead that I've ever seen who wasn't deliberately sexualized. Daisy Ridley is a really beautiful girl, and I mean, I'm not gonna lie, I was so jealous the whole time I was watching it the first time because her face is just like so flawless and perfect. But despite the fact that Daisy Ridley is like really beautiful, she was treated with respect by not being exploited. She actually came across to me as just being a total tomboy who had the mind of an engineer. The thing that I loved about Rey the most is that even though she's really strong and she's tough, she's also very vulnerable. At the end of the day, she just wants to feel connected to a group of people. She wants her family. She's tired of waiting for her life to begin, but at the same time she's terrified of taking that risk. Which really, when you really come down to it, both men and women can relate to that. Those are just things that are universal. I also really loved Kylo Ren's character a lot more than I initially expected that I would, because I loved how, as a villain, he was deconstructed. By the end of the movie, you just see him as a human being. He's a young guy dressed up in a costume trying to pretend like he's a lot more powerful than he really feels. One of the things that I found really interesting was the reception that fans had to both Rey and Kylo Ren's character. I would say that most people were totally in love with Rey, but you definitely had a pretty vocal group of fanboys. Not all fanboys, mind you, but like a small pocket of the fanboy arena, or whatever you want to call it, that felt that Rey was just this Mary Sue who was overpowered. And then on the flip side, you had Kylo Ren, who was just, a pussy because he got his ass handed to him by a girl. Instead of getting a big baddie that they could jerk off to, they ended up getting this vulnerable, young, emotional guy dressed up in a costume. On top of that, he kills off Han, who's like this legendary character. The negative reactions to these characters it like really contradicted what I saw in the movie. People who claimed that Rey was a nobody who shouldn't have beat Kylo Ren in the end fight didn't really take into consideration that she had grown up on a desert planet where she was forced to fend for herself, and that she had been repeatedly shown throughout the movie to be able to fight. And then we have Kylo Ren, who got shot in the stomach, and instead of being flown off his feet like he should have, he basically just falls to his knees and then gets up and walks it off. And then goes on to fight both Finn and Rey. Even after Rey slashes his face and kicks him to the ground, he's still trying to get up. Despite the fact that he's bleeding and bruised and emotionally overwrought, he doesn't accept defeat. Instead of being offended by these negative responses to these characters, I found it really interesting, especially in relation to my own research. From my experience, people reveal a lot about their attitudes and beliefs through their reactions to things, whether those reactions are conscious or not. And I'm not really here to judge someone's beliefs and whether those things are valid or not. I just feel that Rey and Kylo Ren raise the opportunity to discuss those things, especially where we live in a climate of change and where there seems to be this overlap between like different ways of thinking about the world. Overall, I see Rey and Kylo Ren as individuals who are very equal in their strengths and qualities, and also their weaknesses. Definitely can't forget the weaknesses. Both Rey and Kylo Ren are aggressive and hot-headed. They both use their anger to channel their power. They both struggle with feelings of loneliness and isolation. And where they differ, they complement each other. So for example, Rey is light with a little bit of dark. Kylo Ren is dark with a little bit of light. Kylo Ren is more emotional and has a more spiritual approach to, especially like with the Force. Whereas I would say like Rey is a bit more, she's a bit more level-headed and sensible. So, like, especially where she's very interested in mechanics and has this innate understanding of how things work. So to me, Rey's almost ruled more by the head, whereas Kylo Ren's ruled more by the heart. You can even see this in the way that Kylo Ren single-mindedly pursues things. And his agenda often changes throughout the movie, or at least it appears that his agenda changes. Instead of reasoning out his decisions, he kind of just makes spur-of-the-moment choices that has a lot more to do with how he feels about things than like things that will actually make sense. I think the two biggest examples of this is when he takes Rey from the forest instead of taking the droid, and then when later he offers to be Rey's teacher. I mean, really, how was that going to fly with Snoke, especially when Snoke like wanted Rey for his own reasons? But anyway, I'm digressing. And it's not that Rey isn't emotional or that she doesn't resort to her emotions, especially when defending herself, but it just seems to me that she is more, she's more reasonable in her approach to things. And I can see this panning out, like, if you're gonna argue that Reylo will happen one day. Because Kylo Ren is definitely gonna be the pursuer. And I think that Rey will put up a pretty good fight, even if she, like, has feelings or she has that temptation towards the dark side, she's gonna reason it out. So now that I've talked about Rey and Kylo Ren as individual characters, I'm gonna talk about Reylo, my favorite subject. So Reylo has actually been kind of a controversial ship. It's triggered a lot of emotions. There's been accusations of incest, of racism, homophobia, that it supports abuse, which honestly is just a bunch of bullshit. I used to get really fired up whenever I heard an anti rattle off about how Reylo is an abusive ship, but now I actually see it from a very different perspective. Like I discussed earlier with the negative reactions towards Rey and Kylo Ren's characters as revealing attitudes and beliefs, I would really say the same for the anti's reaction to Reylo. And like I said before, it's not really my place to judge about people's beliefs or their mindset about things. It's more just interesting to explore these topics, especially in relation to the real world and maybe conversations that are taking place at the moment, if that makes sense. So I can't really generalize the antis too much because I'm sure that they all have different reasons for not liking Reylo, which is their prerogative, but I would say that the most recurring theme in their accusations is that, I guess what it reveals to me is that they don't like the fact that Rey is initially vulnerable to Kylo Ren. Maybe at one point they themselves felt very vulnerable to another person, and so they hate seeing that in Rey's character. And so there's this expectation almost that Rey is never supposed to be vulnerable. She's always supposed to be strong and have the upper hand. This reaction reminds me a lot of how sometimes, like, as a girl, especially because I love to play sports and I like to be in the thick of the action, and sometimes it sucks because instead of being treated as an equal team member, you have guys on the opposite team who don't want to touch you for fear of grabbing your boob. And so they kind of just let you slide right past them and get the ball in the goal. So yeah, I feel like there's a similar mentality when it comes to having negative feelings towards Reylo. Especially because when Rey and Kylo Ren first meet in the forest and then also in the early part of the interrogation scene, Rey is definitely vulnerable to Kylo Ren and he seems like a more dominating presence. And while he's clearly fascinated by Rey and doesn't seem to have ill will towards her, he's not really afraid to provoke her. When I first saw The Force Awakens, initially I was really curious to see how the dynamic between Kylo Ren and Rey would be handled, because I had never really seen a dynamic between a female, a heroine and a villain. I had never really seen that played out before. So when I finally did get to see the way that these two characters interacted with each other, it was very confusing because there was some obvious antagonism there. But there was also a lot of sexual tension. And I think a lot of this has a lot to do with the Death and the Maiden archetype. There's a really good post on Tumblr about the Death and the Maiden archetype. I can't remember who the original poster is, but I'll definitely leave a link in my description box for those of you who are interested. But basically, the Hades and Persephone myth is the granddaddy of the Death and the Maiden archetype. So within literature and mythology, you have, different archetypes and tropes that have been used again and again throughout the centuries. And where the hero's journey, which was which kind of focuses more on like the man's journey, which I guess you would see like with the original trilogy with Luke. The Death and the Maiden archetype definitely focuses more on the heroine's journey. They do have some interesting similarities though, because with the hero's journey, you have like one of the first obstacles is the call to action, but then rejecting that call to action, which we do see initially with Rey when she's presented with Luke's lightsaber and then she runs from Maz Kanata's castle into the forest. The Death and the Maiden has a similar obstacle where the heroine is where she is normally abducted by kind of this darker, more dominating, powerful man, and she rejects him initially. Her maturity and growth as a woman comes with accepting this man. Obviously, there are a lot of variations to this archetype, but generally has a lot to do with a girl's journey to womanhood and mature sexuality. So there's definitely an erotic undertone to this archetype. It's kind of complicated though, because you have sort of this dominant submissive quality to it, which in a post 50 Shades of Grey world is very misunderstood. But you also have this other element to it where, because the woman does initially push back on the man, who is this more aggressive, dominant, powerful figure, she ultimately earns his respect and becomes his equal. And really, in the end, she becomes a powerful force to be reckoned with herself, because he actually sort of gives up some of his power in order to have that balance to their relationship. Ultimately, the Hades and Persephone myth and the Death and the Maiden archetype has a lot to do with dualities in nature. There is no light without dark, there is no winter without spring, there is no death without life. So all of these seemingly opposite things in nature are actually necessary to one another, and they're complementary. So we definitely see this with Rey and Kylo Ren, but I think that that Rey and Kylo Ren kind of take it to the next level, because in a lot of ways Rey is definitely like she proves herself to be Kylo Ren's equal, very much so. And we do see that Kylo Ren has a lot of respect for Rey because she does push back on him. Initially, he does present himself as being kind of like this peacock where he struts his stuff and is a little arrogant. He's a little bit on the cocky side, but when she pushes back on him, he is like completely shocked. But at the same time, he has a lot of admiration for her power. I think the thing that I find really great about the Reylo ship is that you do have a male character who definitely is not afraid to challenge the heroine. Even when you look at their duel in the forest, he kind of toes that line of, like he is definitely fighting back in a way, but he never really crosses that line of actually attacking her. It's almost like he's pushing her to see how strong she is. He's feeling out her power in a way. And I think ultimately these two characters are great for each other, because Kylo Ren is more of maybe an aggressive, dominant sort of personality, but because Rey is kind of the same way, she's not afraid to push back on him, and he's receptive to that because he ultimately admires power. So in that sense, I feel like you have a male and a female character who are truly equal. But at the same time, that obvious aggression and antagonism kind of overshadows, or at least it distracts from, the instances of protectiveness that Kylo Ren does display towards Rey. When you really consider the context of this relationship, which is war, they're fighting on opposite sides. But when you think about all of the things that Kylo Ren really could have done and all of the lines he could have crossed, for example, he didn't have to bridal carry Rey. He didn't have to have any physical interaction with her at all. Like with Poe, he could have had his stormtroopers take her to the ship. And where Poe actually went with the stormtroopers, Kylo Ren took Rey with him on his personal ship. And then he carried her to the interrogation room himself. And I feel like this is significant because it shows that he really doesn't want any other member of the First Order to be involved in the situation. Because obviously their agenda is going to be much different from his, and they're more likely to treat her as a true captive than he will. And then where you have him treating her almost as a welcome prisoner, And then when she tells him to get out of her head, and instead of pushing further, he actually does step away while still trying to maintain control of the situation. Because ultimately he does need the map to the droid. And him taking Rey was definitely more out of personal interest, but getting the map out of her mind would have justified his decision. In The Force Awakens, we have Rey who inflicts physical harm on Kylo Ren, and we also have Kylo Ren who inflicts some physical harm on Rey. Obviously, this isn't necessarily what I would want to see in their relationship long term, like if Reylo actually does become canon or they develop like trust and romance between the two. But one thing that I do really love about their initial relationship is that they are truly equal. They are not afraid to challenge each other. And I think to have a dynamic between a male and a female character, you know, where they are equal, you have to have two characters who are both are willing to be presented as both strong and vulnerable and have that be interchangeable. So yeah, I think you get my point. It's starting to get pretty late where I'm at, and so I'm kind of like starting to ramble and go on tangents because I'm really tired. This definitely wasn't as succinct as my first video, but I got everything out that I wanted to say, and so now I'm really curious to see what you have to say about this. Definitely feel free to tell me what you think, to chip in your ideas. I'm completely open to hearing different opinions and perspectives, as long as those perspectives, well, so many P's, but as long as those ideas are expressed respectfully. Thank you so much for listening to my long video and all of my fangirl ramblings. I hope that you enjoyed. See you next time.